I am not a man given to sentiment. My brother Edwin would tell you that with a laugh, would have told you, I should say, before drink and poor judgment finished what the creditors started. But I have lived long enough to understand that a man who calls himself unsentimental is usually the man who has seen something so worth remembering that he has kept it close and quiet for 30 years, the way you keep a coal in your palm when the night is cold. This is the thing I have kept. I was present the morning Edwin Morrow signed away his eldest daughter. I do not use the phrase lightly, and I did not use it lightly then, standing in the corner of his study with my hat in my hands, my jaw so tight I could hear my own teeth. Edwin had been borrowing against the house, the land, the furniture, and finally against the air in the room since my father died, and the edifice had come down at last in the spring of 1818, with the spectacular completeness of a wall that has been quietly crumbling for 20 years before anyone notices the dust. The debt was £12,000. The man who held the majority of it was not a banker but a peer of the realm, and the peer did not want money. He had money. What he wanted, through some mechanism I still do not entirely understand, was a resolution, clean, legal, documented. And the resolution his solicitor had placed on Edwin's desk, in handwriting so precise it appeared printed, named as its principal instrument my niece, Elspeth Morrow, 23 years old. Unmarried, which her mother called a failing and which I had always privately thought was the universe showing unusual good sense, given the men who had applied. Tall, with a quality of stillness that made rooms quieter when she entered them, which people frequently mistook for coldness, and which was in fact the opposite. She was so present, so genuinely attending to whatever was in front of her, that she had no noise left over for performing. She read more than anyone I have ever known in 3 languages, and she had the habit, maddening to her mother, quietly magnificent to me, of saying precisely what she meant. She had been, before Edwin's collapse, the kind of woman who was always pointed at her mother's sofa parties and described in the same handful of words, accomplished, quiet, not unattractive in a plain way. These are the words society uses for women it has not bothered to examine. The women who receive them are generally either far less than the words describe or far more, and in Elspeth's case there was no contest. She was the kind of more that took most people years to find, because finding it required you to sit still long enough to look, which was not something most people at her mother's sofa parties had been practicing. The instrument on Edwin's desk proposed that she be given as bride to the debt holder in exchange for the full satisfaction of the £12,000, the release of all claims against the Morrow estate, and a settlement of £400 per annum on the family going forward. It was written with the dry elegance of a property transfer. The word love did not appear in it. Neither did the word choice. The debt holder was the Duke of Carrowen. I had never met him. No one I knew had met him. He was one of those men about whom society has so thoroughly agreed upon a story that the story has replaced the man entirely. Cold, they said. Ruthless, said others. He had dismissed 3 housekeepers in a year, refused every invitation the county had offered him since he inherited, and was reported to have told the last woman his mother had presented to him for consideration that he was not, as yet, in the market for furniture. Whether he had actually said this, I could not know, but it had spread. It had the ring of a thing too unpleasant to have been invented. Scores of years of Carrowens before him, the title passing through men of varying distinction, and this one had apparently decided that the distinction he would cultivate was inapproachability. There were stories about the estate itself, that the house was cold as a church, that the servants rarely lasted a full year, that he had once sent back an entire dinner party's worth of invitations with a single note that read, in its entirety, "Regret unable, Carrowen." Not even a year on the note, just the estate name doing its work as a full sentence. I stood in Edwin's study, and I watched the solicitor point to the line where my brother was to sign, and I opened my mouth. The door opened instead. Elspeth came in without knocking, which was characteristic. She looked at the papers on the desk, at the solicitor's gloved finger on the line, and at her father's pen already lifted. She crossed the room in 4 strides, picked up the document and read it. Not skimmed it, read it. The solicitor watched her with the expression of a man who has handled documents for 30 years and never once had one taken from him by a woman in a morning dress with ink on her left thumb. Edwin said her name in a warning tone that had never worked on her in 23 years and did not work now. When she finished, she set it down. She set it down with the particular care you use when you are very deliberately not throwing something. "I will sign it," she said. Edwin exhaled with relief. I felt my stomach drop. After, she continued, "These 3 terms are added." The solicitor looked at Edwin. Edwin looked at the wall. I looked at Elspeth. "First," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, the voice of a woman who has had this conversation privately for some hours already and has resolved every counterargument before arriving. "I will not be a prisoner. The arrangement must include explicit written provision that I am free to walk the grounds, to receive correspondence, and to leave the estate in company for any reasonable purpose, and that no one may confine me to a wing or a room or a schedule without my agreement." The solicitor's pen had not moved. "Second, I will be introduced to the Duke by letter, if he prefers, or in person before any signing. I am not a parcel to be left on a step." "Elspeth," Edwin began. "Third, the arrangement is for 1 year. At the end of that year, both parties may choose to continue or to dissolve, with no financial penalty on either side and with my future income, the settlement preserved regardless." She turned to the solicitor. "Add those 3 terms and I will sign today. Present them as my conditions, not my father's. If the Duke objects to any of them, I would like his objections in writing, so that I may read precisely what he finds unreasonable." There was a silence in the study. A fire was burning too hot in the grate. I remember noticing the smell of scorched birch. The solicitor, I will give him this, was a professional. He asked Edwin's permission with his eyes, received some crumbling nod, and wrote. He wrote all 3. He asked Elspeth to restate the 3rd term's conditions clearly, and she did, without hesitation, as though she had composed them over breakfast and was simply reading them back from memory. Then he asked her to speak again, slowly, the precise language she wanted for freedom of correspondence, and she gave it to him with the patience of a woman who is accustomed to having to repeat herself to men who did not expect to need her precision. He took the document away to present to the Duke. The reply came in 4 days. 4 days is not a long time in matters of property and negotiation, but I measured each of them in the silences of Edwin's house, where Elspeth went about her days with a composure that I found either admirable or alarming, depending on which hour of the day I encountered it. She was packing in a methodical way, selecting what to take with care and without apparent grief. The books first. Always the books first. The Duke had agreed to all 3 terms. His note, forwarded through the solicitor and written in a hand even more precise than his man of business, said only this: "The terms are reasonable. Tell Miss Morrow I look forward to her arrival." Not to her father's arrival, not to the resolution of the matter, to her arrival. I rode with her to Carrowen Hall. Edwin did not come. He was settling into the relief of a man whose wall has been shored up at someone else's expense, and I think the sight of Elspeth's trunk being loaded onto the carriage would have required of him an honesty he had never been able to afford. It was a long drive into the northern hills, the kind of country that is beautiful in a way that makes you want to apologize for the word. The fields gave way to moorland, and the moorland gave way to a pass between 2 hills that funneled the wind in a way the driver had clearly experienced before and the horses had not. Then the country opened again on the other side, and the sky was different, wider, the clouds moving faster, the light coming in strips between them like something considered rather than accidental. The estate emerged from the tree line at the end of the 2nd hour, gray stone, older than the title, set against a sky that could not decide between cloud and sun. The windows caught the uncertain light and threw it back at us in pieces. There was a lake to the east, mostly visible as a gleam through the trees, and a series of formal gardens that had been allowed to become semi-formal, which is the horticultural condition of a house that has good taste, but no one at present instructing the groundskeepers with specificity. Elspeth sat across from me and watched it come. She did not look afraid. I would not have said she looked eager. She looked like a woman doing a calculation in her head, adding up everything that was known and setting aside, cleanly, everything that was not. "You don't have to go in," I said. The words were useless. I said them anyway. "I know," she said. "I want to understand what it is I've agreed to." "It's a house," I said. "He's a man." "Yes," she said, and looked at me with the particular patience she had always shown when I said something true but insufficient. "That's what I mean." The carriage stopped. A steward materialized at the door with the speed and silence of a man accustomed to arrivals he had been warned about, and behind the steward, at the top of 3 stone steps, stood the Duke of Carrowen. He was not what I had expected. I cannot tell you precisely what I had expected, some composite of the rumors, I suppose, a man-shaped collection of cold glances and dismissive gestures. He was tall, yes, and the set of his shoulders suggested he had spent time carrying things heavier than his tailcoat. His face was neither cruel nor kind. It was the face of a man who had decided, at some point, that it was simpler not to show what he was thinking, and had become practiced at it. His hair was dark. He had the look, I thought, of someone who had been still for a long time, and who had grown so accustomed to stillness that motion now cost him something. He came down the steps. Not waited at the top, as a man of his position might reasonably have done, with the whole entrance working in his favor, descended to meet us, which surprised me, and appeared to surprise even his steward, who adjusted his expression very slightly and then did not adjust it again, because Croft was the sort of man who adjusted things once and then considered the matter concluded. He looked at Elspeth. She looked back. "Miss Morrow," he said, "I am Calthorpe. Not your Grace by way of reminder. Not the Duke," which would have been placing the title between them like a piece of furniture to negotiate around. Just his name, offered like something he rarely offered. "Your Grace," she said, "thank you for agreeing to my terms." A pause. Something moved through his expression that I could not name, not quite surprise, not quite the beginning of something else, perhaps a reappraisal of some mental image he had been carrying. "You were not unreasonable," he said. It was, I would later understand, high praise. He led us inside. The hall was vast and very cold and furnished in the manner of a man who has made his peace with grandeur but takes no pleasure in it, everything excellent, nothing warm. Good chairs that no one sat in. Good paintings that faced walls nobody stood against. The kind of house that has been very well maintained and very rarely inhabited, which gives it the quality of a theater between productions. All the elements present, none of them in use. He did not offer a tour. He showed Elspeth the room that was to be hers, a large room on the east side, with a window that gave onto the kitchen garden and a view of the hills beyond, the same hills we had come through, and he showed her the library. He opened the door to the library and stepped aside to let her pass, and I watched her face. She did not gasp. She was not a woman who gasped, but she went still in a different way than her usual stillness. The way a person goes still when they have encountered something they had not permitted themselves to hope for and have now found, and must manage the discovery quietly enough to seem unmoved. The library was enormous. 2 floors of shelves, a gallery around the upper level reached by a narrow iron stair, a pair of reading chairs angled toward the fireplace with the worn-in comfort of chairs that had actually been sat in, which was more than could be said of most of the furniture in the house. The shelves were ordered without being austere. There were gaps where books had been removed and not replaced in the gap, which meant they had been read, not just housed. There were one or two places where a book had been shelved horizontally on top of others, because there was no room and someone had not bothered to reorganize. It was the library of a man who used it rather than displayed it. "You may use it as you like," the Duke said from the doorway, "at any hour." Elspeth turned and looked at him. "Any hour," she repeated, not a question. "I keep unusual hours myself," he said. "The library is generally available." She nodded once formally. "Then I suspect we will suit one another." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a polite moment. "I hope so," he said, and he left us in the library and walked back down the hall, and the sound of his footsteps was the sound of a man who was making an effort to walk at a normal pace and had not entirely succeeded. I stayed 3 days. I will not say those 3 days changed everything. That would be too neat, and nothing about Elspeth's story was neat. It was all accretion, each small thing adding to each small thing until the whole was undeniable. But I noticed things in those 3 days that I filed away with the seriousness of a man who knew he was being given a first chapter and did not want to misread it. I noticed that the Duke appeared at dinner on the first evening wearing a different coat than he had worn to greet us pressed, a darker blue, the kind of change a man makes when he has gone upstairs and considered it, and then made it, and then thought about whether it was too obvious, and then come down anyway. I noticed that he spoke very little at dinner but listened with extraordinary completeness, so that when Elspeth said something, 2 or 3 exchanges later, he would produce the word she had used earlier and build on it, as if he had been holding it in reserve. I noticed that he twice started to say something and stopped, not because he had changed his mind, I thought, but because he was not yet sure whether what he wanted to say was appropriate to the situation as it currently stood, which was new, I suspected, to a man not accustomed to caring what was appropriate. I noticed, on the second morning, that the steward Croft moved through the house with the ease of a man who has been in the same employ for many years, and has watched the same man for all of them, and that he watched the Duke the way you watch something that has been one way for a long time and has now, very slightly, begun to be different. I noticed, on the third morning, that the Duke was in the kitchen garden before breakfast, walking the rows of winter vegetables with the slow attention of a man who is not particularly interested in the vegetables, but is hoping to encounter someone who has already discovered the garden at first light. Elspeth had, on the first morning, gone out to the garden before I came downstairs, and when I asked Croft where she was he had told me quietly that Miss Morrow had gone to have a look at the garden, and he said it in a tone that suggested this had already been noted by the household as a development of interest. She did it again on the third morning. The Duke was there before her, studying a row of parsnips with an intensity those parsnips had never previously warranted. I pretended not to see any of it. This was the appropriate thing to do. When I left, I embraced Elspeth in the carriage yard, and she held on for a moment longer than she usually did, which was uncharacteristic, and I did not say anything about it because she was not a woman who wanted to have the thing named. "Write to me," I said. "Every week," she said. And she did. For the next 12 months, and in several respects beyond them, she did. I will not read you the letters entire. They were hers, and she wrote them for me, not for any audience. But I will tell you what they showed, those weekly pages in her careful, slightly impatient hand, because they were, in their accumulation, the best portrait of a love I have ever had the privilege to witness from the outside, and I owe it to the story to give it its full weight. The early letters were observational. She wrote about the house with the precision of a naturalist making field notes. The east wing leaked heat through 3 ill-fitted windows. The kitchen staff were efficient and not unkind. The groundskeepers were capable but unstimulated, which she said manifested in a conservatism about the garden that she was not sure she could leave unchallenged. She wrote about the library with something close to ardor. The collection was extraordinary, she said, acquired over 4 generations with taste and without vanity, which meant it was full of things worth reading rather than things worth displaying. She had found 3 volumes in the Italian she had not known existed in translation. She had found a shelf of natural philosophy that was more current than anything she had encountered outside London. She had found, tucked behind a large compendium of heraldry that had clearly not been moved in years, a small notebook in a handwriting that was not the current Duke's, which contained what appeared to be the beginnings of a novel in French that broke off abruptly in the middle of a sentence in the 7th chapter. "I have not yet decided," she wrote, "whether to mention the notebook to His Grace. It is possible it belongs to him, in which case mentioning it would be an intrusion. It is also possible it was his father's or his grandfather's, in which case it is an inheritance, and inheritances should not be left behind compendiums of heraldry." She wrote about the Duke at a careful distance. The distance was deliberate. I could see its deliberateness in the construction of the sentences, which gave him appropriate room, neither too much nor too little, the way you give a new country a fair amount of page before you begin annotating it. He was present at dinner and absent at breakfast. He worked until very late. She had seen the light under his study door at 2 in the morning when she walked back from the library. He was courteous and precise and said very little about himself, which she found, she wrote, more interesting than a man who said a great deal. "Most men speak about themselves," she wrote, "in the way they breathe automatically without noticing. He does not. When he mentions something of his own experience, it is because he has decided to, and there is a quality to it, a kind of weight, that I cannot account for except that it seems he does not spend words idly. I find I attend to what he says more carefully as a result, because the attending is warranted. In the 4th week, he asks better questions than anyone I have met. Most men ask questions as a kind of performance, so that you will see they have thought to ask. He asks because he wants to know the answer. It is a different thing entirely, and it takes some getting used to." In the 5th week she mentioned that she had found the courage to ask him about the French notebook. She had left it on the library table with a note. "I found this. I do not know whose it is, but whoever began chapter 8 owes the reader an ending." The following morning there had been a note in reply, on the same piece of paper below hers. "My grandmother's. She abandoned it in 1784. I have often thought chapter 8 would have been worth it." And then below that, in a different ink as though added later, "The reader is owed many things. Not all debts are recoverable." I do not know what he meant by the last line, she wrote to me. I have been thinking about it for 3 days. In the 6th week, she wrote that he had begun coming to the library in the evenings. Not intruding, not forcing conversation. He would arrive with a book already open, settle into the 2nd chair, the one she had not been using, which became, quietly and without discussion, his chair, and read. Sometimes they spoke, more often they did not. "I had thought," she wrote, "that silence with someone you do not fully know yet would be the uncomfortable kind, the kind where both parties are doing the labor of not speaking and can hear each other do it. This is not that. I cannot fully explain what it is instead. I could explain it." I did not write back with the explanation, because she was making her own progress, and an uncle's explanation would have been approximately as useful as telling someone who is learning to swim that water is wet. In the 7th week, she wrote that she had begun reading aloud. Not to him specifically. She had simply been reading by the fire after dinner and had encountered a passage she found remarkable and had read it aloud without thinking, the way you do when you are alone in a room and the words want a voice. She had looked up afterward, startled at herself, and found him watching her, not with the expression of a man interrupted, but with the expression of a man who has been listening for some time and has found the experience not unpleasant. "He said nothing," she wrote, "but he marked his page, which I understand is a significant gesture from a man who has spent 20 years apparently not marking pages." The letters changed in the 8th week. Not dramatically. Elspeth was not a dramatic correspondent, but the distance at which she had been writing about the Duke began, incrementally, to close. She mentioned that he had noticed she was not at dinner one evening. She had had a headache and sent apologies, and that he had sent up a tray himself, rather than having it done by the kitchen, and had included a note with it. The note, she said, was 3 words. Rest. Don't apologize. She had kept it. She did not say why she had mentioned keeping it, and I did not ask. She mentioned that they had walked the grounds together on a Sunday, the first time they had gone anywhere together beyond the library. He had shown her the ruin of a medieval chapel at the far edge of the estate, half swallowed by ivy, the walls still standing to about 8 feet in most places, the roof long since open to the sky and the weather. He had known which stones had been which rooms: the nave, the small sacristy to the east, the place where the font had stood, and had been able to tell her with the ease of a man who has walked those stones alone many times and never before had anyone to tell. He is good at that, she wrote, knowing things about places that no one else has thought to know. As though he has been paying attention to things that most people walk past. In the 9th week, she told me about the evening he had asked about her father's house, not about Edwin specifically, but about the house where she had grown up, the garden, the room she had read in. She had described it carefully, including the window that faced east and let in the morning light, and the shelf above the door where her father had kept the 3 volumes he never read but felt it important to own. The Duke had listened. Then he had said, "Do you miss it?" Not the house, she understood, not the stones and the windows, the morning light, the particular quality of knowing every corner. She had told him honestly, "I miss the certainty of knowing where everything is. I do not miss the rest of it very much." He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "The east window in your room here faces the hills. You will know the light there eventually." It was a practical observation, she wrote to me. He said it as a practical observation. I have not been able to stop thinking about it. In the 10th week, the 11th, the 12th, the letters continued, and in each one the Duke was a little nearer on the page. She wrote about a disagreement over the Italian translation she had found. She thought the translator had been faithful to the words and faithless to the feeling. He had the opposite complaint about a different passage, and they had gone round it for an entire evening in the library with the book between them, both of them making the other's argument better by the end than they had at the beginning. She wrote about finding him in the stable yard one morning, mending a piece of bridle that should have been given to the groom, doing it himself with the focused competence of a man who does not find it beneath him to know how things work. She wrote about a piece of music he had played once, badly, on an old pianoforte in the drawing room when he thought the house was empty, and how she had sat outside the door and not gone in because she understood, without being told, that this was something he did alone and had not yet decided to share. In the 11th week, she wrote about a morning she had spent in the estate's account room going over some figures Croft had left out, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had encountered them by accident and found them interesting and had kept going. The Duke had found her there 2 hours later with 3 ledgers open and a page of her own calculations beside them. He had stood in the doorway for a moment. She had looked up and said that his grain contracts for the southern field were at least a season out of date. He had come in, sat down across from her, and they had spent the next hour going through the ledgers together, and he had asked for her analysis of 2 disputed figures with the matter-of-fact directness of a man asking for input he actually intended to use. "He did not ask whether I had done this before," she wrote. "He did not express surprise that I could read a ledger. He simply asked what I thought about the southern grain figures and then listened to the answer. I have been in rooms with men my entire adult life. I can count on 3 fingers the ones who have asked my opinion on something practical and then listened to the answer." She did not name me among those 3. She did not have to. In the 12th week, she wrote about an evening when neither of them had been reading. Unusually, she had been writing letters. He had been dealing with correspondence of his own, and there had been a long silence in the library that was different from the usual silence. She had looked up at some point and found him not reading and not writing, but looking at the fire with the look of a man whose thoughts had gone somewhere difficult. She had not asked. They had sat in that silence for some time, and eventually he had said, not to her, almost to the room, "I find this less," and then stopped. And after a moment, "I find the evenings have become less long." She had not said anything. She had returned to her letter and let the observation stand. "I am becoming," she wrote, "aware of him in the way you become aware of weather. Not a constant preoccupation, not yet, but a condition. The way you know without checking whether the sky is clear." She added below that, in slightly smaller writing, as though she had gone back to the letter after a pause, "I do not know what to do with that. I suppose I am doing it already, which is perhaps the answer." I folded the letter and sat with it a while. Then I went on with my day, carrying it the way you carry things you intend to think about more carefully later. It was around this time that the creditors reappeared. I call them creditors because that is the cleanest word. Edwin, in his relief, had spent the winter somewhat freely, as men do when they have been given a reprieve and have not quite understood what it cost. He had opened a new line of accounts in the spring, had made several purchases that strained credulity, and had, with the particular talent he had always shown for selecting the worst possible moment for every decision, attracted the attention of a man named Holt. Holt held a minority portion of the original Morrow debt, a sliver compared to the Duke's majority, but legally independent because Edwin had borrowed from multiple sources and the original settlement arrangement had addressed only the Duke's portion. Holt had been patient through the winter. He was no longer patient. His position was legal if ugly. He had not been party to the arrangement made with the Duke. He held his own claim, independent and unresolved. The argument he put forward through his own solicitor, in a letter that arrived at Edwin's address and at Carrowen Hall simultaneously, which told you immediately that the letter was not primarily about money, was this: that the original arrangement, having been made to settle specific debts, could not be said to settle a debt to which the arranger had not been a party, that the instrument in its existing form was therefore incomplete, and that in order to properly resolve the full liability, Miss Morrow's situation would need to be reconsidered. Reconsidered. The word of a man who has decided to use the law as a crowbar and has had a solicitor file the blade smooth, so it will not obviously cut the hand. What he wanted, stripped of the language, was the arrangement undone. Whether he wanted Elspeth returned to her father's house so that some other disposal could be made of the matter, or whether he simply wanted to cause difficulty for the Duke of Carrowen, with whom, it later emerged, he had a quarrel older and uglier than anything to do with the Morrows, having to do with a property matter some years back that Holt had lost and had not forgiven. I did not know and did not much care. What he wanted would have taken Elspeth out of Carrowen Hall. I rode for the hall the morning I received word. I was not, let me be clear, the man whose action would determine anything. I had no legal standing. Edwin had legal standing and was using it primarily to tremble in his drawing room and wait for someone else to resolve it. I went because I could not sit in my own house and wait, and because Elspeth was my niece and the best person I have ever known, and I had made her no promises when she came here, but I had made them silently to myself. I was admitted immediately. Croft showed no surprise at my arrival, which suggested either that he had been told to expect me or that very little surprised him, and in 20 years of service to a complicated man, both were plausible. He put me in the morning room with tea, and within 10 minutes the Duke came in. He did not look like a man who had been surprised by the situation. He looked like a man who had been thinking about it for some hours with great intensity, and had reached the end of that thinking, and was now sitting with the result. He sat down. He did not offer a social pleasantry. He said, "You've seen Holt's letter." "This morning," I said. "His claim has some legal basis," the Duke said. His voice was level, the voice of a man reporting the territory accurately even when the territory is against him. "Narrow, but not nothing. My solicitor believes it could be contested, but the contest would be months, possibly a year. A pause. Elspeth would be in an uncertain position throughout. "Where is she?" I asked. "Library," he said. "She's seen the letter. She came to me last night and told me she thought she should release me from the arrangement, that the legal uncertainty gave me a clean pretext, and that she would not hold me to something that was now causing complication." He stopped. I waited. "She said it very quietly," he said. "The way she says things she has thought through too completely, as though she had already made her peace with it and was presenting it to me as a practical matter, something that had a sensible solution if only one were willing to take it." He looked at his hands, one still on the table, one not. "She was not at peace with it," he said. "She was being generous with me at considerable cost to herself, and she was hoping, I believe, that I would not accept." He said it without sentimentality, which made it the truest thing anyone had said in that house in some time. "You didn't accept," I said. "No," he said, "I did not." He rose from the table and I rose with him. "I need you to witness something," he said. "It needs someone who is family to her." He took me to his study. The study was large and ordered with the seriousness of a room that is actually used, papers stacked with intention, books with notes tucked into them at irregular angles, 2 candles burned entirely to nothing, and not yet replaced because the man who usually replaced them had not yet come in, and the occupant of the study had been here since before dawn and had not noticed. On the desk lay 2 documents. The first was the original arrangement, with its precise solicitor's hand and its 3 additional terms in Elspeth's writing. I recognized her handwriting immediately, the slight forward lean of it, the T's crossed with more energy than was strictly necessary. The second was a newer document, in the Duke's own hand. He picked up the original arrangement. He tore it. Not violently, deliberately once, cleanly across the center, the sound of good paper parting cleanly, which is a sound that does not sound like destruction but does not sound like anything else either. He laid both halves flat on the desk and smoothed them with his palm, a gesture that seemed almost like an acknowledgement. Then he picked up the new document. I read it. I am not a solicitor, but I have read enough documents in my life to understand what was in front of me. It was brief, 1 page, perhaps 200 words in the Duke's clean and careful hand. It said in substance this: that the preceding arrangement was dissolved in full, that all debts attached to the Morrow family name were simultaneously forgiven, not settled, forgiven, with the Duke absorbing them directly, including Holt's claim, for which he had already this morning made written provision at a figure his steward later confirmed was considerably more than Holt had been owed, because the Duke had added a margin that said, clearly and without legal language, that Holt was not to contact the Morrow family or anyone connected to the estate of Carrowen on this matter or any other, ever again. That the settlement of £400 per annum to the Morrow family would continue, because he had promised it and his word did not dissolve with the paper. And then a single final clause, which was not in the language of a legal document at all. Miss Elspeth Morrow is entirely free of any obligation arising from this or any prior arrangement. Should she wish to remain at Carrowen Hall, it will be on no terms but her own choosing, with no condition attached and no accounting required of her. The Duke of Carrowen asks only that she know she is wanted here, not as an instrument of settlement, not as a resolution of a debt, but as herself, which is a thing the Duke has come to value above any consideration of business or society or whatever remained of his common sense. He had written that last clause, whatever remained of his common sense, and left it in. I cannot tell you precisely why I found that as moving as I did. Perhaps because it was honest in a way that practical men rarely permit themselves in formal writing. Perhaps because you could see, in the very slight irregularity of the handwriting in that clause, that he had written it last and written it quickly, before he could remove it, and then had looked at it, and had not removed it. "Call Elspeth," I said. He was already at the door. She came in the way she always moved, contained, attending, the stillness that was never coldness. She looked at the two halves of the old document on the desk, and then at the new one, and then at the Duke, and I watched her read him the way she had always been able to read things, quickly, completely, without performing the reading. "Silas is here to witness," the Duke said, "if you want to read it." She read it. She stood at the desk and read it with the same care she brought to everything, and I watched her reach the final clause, and I watched her read it again. Her back was mostly to me, but I could see her profile, and what was on her face was not the calculation she had been doing since the autumn. It was something quieter than calculation and considerably more important. When she finished, she straightened and turned, not to me, to him. "You bought Outholt's claim this morning," she said. "My steward took the papers before dawn," he said. "It's done." "You didn't tell me." "I wanted to tell you with this in front of you," he said, and gestured at the document, "so that you could see that it is not a new arrangement and not an obligation. I did not do it to bind you. I did it because the alternative was sitting in my study, while a man I have never respected used your situation as a device, and I found I was not equal to sitting still for that." Elspeth looked at him for a long moment. "The last clause," she said. He did not look away. "Yes." "Did you mean it?" "Every word," he said, "including the part about my common sense." A pause. In the grate, a coal shifted and settled. Outside the study window, the hills were doing their thing with the uncertain light, brilliant one moment, gray the next, as though they could not decide what to offer. "I came to you last night," Elspeth said, "and offered to go because I thought you would be relieved. I thought that was the decent thing, to give you the door, and let you take it without having to ask me to leave. I was afraid that I had been here long enough to want to stay, and that wanting to stay when someone would prefer you to go is a particular kind of undignified, and I would rather dissolve the whole thing with grace than be quietly tolerated in a house where I am excess furniture." "I know," the Duke said. "You are not relieved." "I have not slept," he said. "I believe that is the opposite of relief." She looked at the document again, then at him. "You wrote, valued above any consideration of business or society." "Yes." "That is a great deal to put in a legal document." "Was meant," he said, "for a different purpose than the legal portions." His voice, which had been steady throughout, the voice of a man who has been holding himself to account very carefully and intends to continue, shifted very slightly on the last words. The way a weight shifts when you have been carrying it a long way and are very nearly home. "I was attempting to be honest on paper," he said, "because I have found it somewhat difficult to be honest aloud, and I could not spend another night being neither." There was a silence, not the kind that needed filling. The kind that is doing something, quietly, the way the ground does something in early spring before anything is visible. "I would like to stay," Elspeth said. "Not under terms of any kind. Not out of obligation, not because the arrangement was written that way. I would like to stay because I want to be here, and because this library is the finest I have ever read in, and because you ask questions because you want the answers, and because you walked to the kitchen garden at first light on the third day and spent 10 minutes examining parsnips that did not require it." The Duke's expression did something then that I do not have a clean name for. It was not a smile, not quite, not yet, but it was the thing that precedes one, when the face catches up to the feeling and admits it has been there some time. "The parsnips," he said, "are not particularly interesting." "No," she said. "I was aware of that at the time." "I know," she said. "I signed the document. That was my function, and I performed it with the solemnity the occasion warranted. The Duke's solicitor came that afternoon and added the formal witness seal, and Holt's counterclaim was answered before the week was out with a thoroughness that left no door. The original arrangement lay in 2 pieces at the side of the study desk, and was taken to the grate that evening. I stayed 2 more days, which the Duke requested with a brevity that passed for casualness, and which I understood as something more. I think he wanted a witness to the first ordinary days, the first days in which nothing was at stake and the situation was simply itself, without the pressure of legal uncertainty or the question of whether she was staying. I was glad to stay. I watched them at dinner those 2 evenings, and what I saw was this: 2 people who had established the habit of each other and had now been given the formal permission to keep it. It looked the same as it had looked for months. It also looked completely different. Permission does that. Edwin received his $400 a year and an additional letter from the Duke's solicitor, strongly suggesting he restructure his accounts, which Edwin received with the grace of a man who has learned to take instruction from the nearest catastrophe and has stopped pretending the catastrophe was anything other than his own invention. I have told you I am not a sentimental man. I maintain this position, largely. But I will tell you what I witnessed in the year that followed, because it is the part of this story that earns everything that came before. I was at Carrowen Hall often, invited often, which was new. The Duke of Carrowen had not previously been a man who invited people often. His previous visitors had included almost no one who was not there on business or obligation. The house changed, not in any grand fashion, nothing redecorated or refurnished wholesale, but gradually, the way temperature changes in a room where a fire has been burning long enough for the walls themselves to hold the warmth. Books appeared on tables that had previously held only lamps. A vase of things from the garden appeared on the hall table, and then on the sideboard, and then, with an increasing confidence of arrangement that suggested someone was paying attention to what lasted and what didn't in several other rooms. The kitchen garden had been expanded. The semi-formal gardens were being attended to with more specificity. The groundskeepers had received, I was told by Croft with his customary restraint, some observations from Miss Morrow about what the beds were capable of if appropriately encouraged, and the observations had been received as direction. They argued about history and the management of the estate and the relative merits of 2 translations of the same Italian text, and whether the chapel ruin should be stabilized or left to continue its picturesque decay. He was not a man who conceded easily, and she was not a woman who conceded at all, and it was the most alive I had ever seen him in any room during any conversation, as though something had been switched on in him that had been very quietly off for years, the part that wants to be pushed back against by someone who knows what they're doing. She did not soften herself to make him comfortable. She did not perform the modesty she had been urged toward her whole life as the correct decoration for a woman's intelligence. She was, in his presence, what she was, and he, in hers, did the same. It is rarer than it sounds. I have been to a great many drawing rooms and dinner tables in my life, and I can count on one hand the couples who seemed to be genuinely in each other's company, rather than in the company of the roles they performed for each other. One evening in the autumn after the document, I arrived at Carrowen Hall at dusk, and Croft told me they were in the garden. I walked to the chapel ruin and found them standing near the old font stone. The Duke had started the stabilization project. I saw, careful and conservative, stopping the collapse without scrubbing away the character, and they were standing in the last of the light with a space between them that was not very much space. I started to call out and then did not. He said something I could not hear, and she turned her face up toward him the way you turn toward warmth, and what happened in that space between them was none of my business, and I was grateful to have witnessed none of it. I found Croft by the kitchen door. "Are they often like that?" I asked. Croft considered the question with his usual seriousness. "They are often in the garden," he said. "They are often like that." "And the Duke," I said, "is he well?" Croft permitted himself a very small expression. "He is, sir," he said, "the most content I have seen him in the 20 years I have served this house." He paused. "He sleeps," he said. He did not always used to. They were married in the new year, quietly, in the chapel at the estate rather than in society, because neither of them had any patience for the performance of it, and the Duke had said he did not require an audience for anything that was only ever going to be between the two of them. The chapel stabilization had been completed by then, the stones sound, the ivy flowering over the new mortar in a way that made it look as though the ivy had been told to and had complied. His mother attended and wept with the pleasant openness of a woman who had been waiting for this a very long time and had not expected to live to see it. Edwin was invited and did not come, which was, on balance, a mercy to everyone including Edwin. Croft stood at the back of the chapel and appeared to be moved, which I would not have believed possible before I saw it, and then thought, 20 years, watching a man be alone in a house that was too large for one person, of course he was moved. I walked Elspeth in. She wore a gown of dark blue that she had chosen herself and that her mother had said was entirely wrong for a wedding, and that was entirely right for Elspeth. She carried nothing. She had no particular expression on her face that I could identify as wedding adjacent, not the anxious brightness of a woman performing happiness, not the distance of a woman bracing herself. She looked as she always looked, present, attending, doing the real calculation. At the chapel door she stopped for a moment and I thought she was nervous, and then I saw she was not nervous at all. She was pausing the way you pause at the top of a long view and take a breath before the descent, not because you fear the going down, but because you want to have the whole of what is in front of you before you move into it. At the front of the chapel, the Duke of Carrowen stood with the look of a man who has been still for a very long time, and is now watching the one thing he has been patient for come toward him down the aisle. Whatever he had done for 35 years with the muscle in his face that stopped it from showing what he felt, it was not doing that today. He had either forgotten to use it or decided not to, and either way it did not matter, because what was on his face was not something that wanted to be hidden. She reached him. He took her hand, not with the gesture of ceremony, with the gesture of a man who has been careful with something in his mind for a long time and has now, finally, been given permission to hold it with his hands instead. I stood in the front pew. The winter light came through the ivy at the high window and went green and gold on the old stones. They said what they said, which was not, I was told by the vicar afterward with mild bewilderment, precisely the prescribed form, because Elspeth had written revisions to the prescribed form, and the Duke had agreed to them, and the result was more honest than the original version while taking approximately the same amount of time. I will tell you the part I heard clearly, which was the last of it. The Duke said, in a voice that was his usual voice, even precise, but with something underneath it that he was not preventing this time, I did not expect you. I did not know what to expect, and what arrived was entirely different from what I would have imagined, which I now understand was the first and most important thing you ever gave me. Elspeth said, I arrived with 3 terms and a great deal of caution. You agreed to all of them. I should have known then. The chapel was small and winterlit, and the handful of us in the pews had the quality of witnesses at something private that had been made, just barely, public enough to be declared. Elspeth wrote to me every week for the first year of the marriage as well, because the habit was established, and she saw no reason to break a useful thing. The letters were different from the hall letters in tone, lighter, more likely to contain a dry observation about something she and the Duke had disagreed about that morning, or a note about the garden progress, or a sentence that was somehow the whole of it compressed. She wrote about the chapel completed now, the stones solid, the ivy restrained at the upper courses. She wrote about a dinner they had hosted, small, at his suggestion rather than hers, which she said she would not have predicted in the autumn, at which he had spoken more than she had ever heard him speak in company, and which she attributed to the fact that the guests were people she had invited rather than people who had arrived with expectations attached. She wrote about a morning she had woken very early and found his side of the bed cold and gone looking for him, and found him in the library, sitting in his chair with a book closed in his lap, doing nothing but sitting in the quiet in the dark before the fire with the expression of a man who is deeply, privately at ease. He had looked up and said, "I often sit here early. I did not think anyone would come." She had sat in the other chair, and they had sat together in the dark for an hour without lighting additional candles, and she had, she said, found it to be one of the best hours she could remember. "That is the thing I did not anticipate," she wrote, in one letter from that first married year. "It is not the large moments. It is the early mornings and the account books and the evenings when neither of us is particularly interesting, and we are simply together in a room, and that is, somehow, enough. I had been told all my life that marriage was a performance, that you performed your role, and he performed his, and the household ran on the energy of the performance. I did not know there was a version in which you could simply be in a room. I had thought that was available only to people who lived alone." I have kept all of her letters. This is not something I usually do with paper. I am not, as I have said, a sentimental man, but these I have kept. There is one I return to most often. It came in the spring after the wedding, when the chapel work was done, and the ivy was putting out new growth over the pointed stone. She wrote about going out early to see it, and finding the Duke already there, and how he had heard her coming and turned and said nothing, but moved to make room for her beside him, and how they had stood together in the early light looking at the old stones made sound again. She had thought, this is what it is to be chosen not in a single declaring moment, but in the daily, unremarkable fact of a man who makes room. "I did not know," she wrote, "when I added my terms to that document in my father's study, what I was signing toward. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was protecting myself from the worst of what such an arrangement could become. I thought the best I could reasonably hope for was a house with a good library and a man who would leave me to it." She had stopped there. I could see where the pen lifted. "He is all of those things," she wrote. "He is considerably more. The considerably more is the part that could not be arranged for. I am not a sentimental man. I have maintained this throughout, and I maintain it now. But I will tell you what I think at the end of 30 more years of thinking about it. I think the right arrangements are not the ones that start with love and hope to maintain it. I think they are the ones that start with honesty. Here is the situation. Here are my terms. Here is what I will not accept, and discover, in the slow accumulation of evenings in a library and mornings in a garden and disagreements about translations and notes on the same piece of paper, that they have become something else entirely. Something that was not planned and cannot be undone, and is, in the end, the only document that matters." Edwin signed a name on a paper and thought he was solving a debt. He was. He was also, without knowing it and without deserving the credit, beginning a love story, which is perhaps the kindest thing I can say about Edwin Morrow, and which I say at his expense entirely. The Duke of Carrowen bought £12,000 of debt and thought he was acquiring a resolution. He was. He also acquired, without planning it and without having the words for it for some months, the only person he had ever met who sat in a library with him in silence and made the silence feel inhabited rather than empty, who read aloud without asking permission and made him mark his page, who went to the kitchen garden at first light and said nothing about the parsnips. Elspeth signed 3 additional terms onto a contract in a cold study, with ink already on her thumb, and thought she was protecting herself. She was. She was also, in that same movement, making room for herself, for what she was worth, for the possibility that a cold house and a difficult man and a clause about reasonable correspondence might turn out to be the beginning of the only morning light she had ever found that was worth knowing. Some arrangements, it turns out, are not arrangements at all. They are the beginning of the only thing.